Hey, Noelle the First here. So in this video, I'm going to talk about my 23andMe results. So if that interests you, stay tuned. So I got my DNA tested about 4 years ago, and I've always been really interested in finding out what my ancestry is because there's always been quite a question mark around it, specifically on my mother's side. Now, my mother was a foster child and was in children's shelters her entire life. She did know her mother, but she didn't really grow up with her mother. So she did have this very unstable childhood. She also knew who her father was, but there was always speculation there, especially because my mother, her entire life, people assumed she was Eurasian. And growing up as a kid in New Jersey and a teenager, I would often have strangers ask me about my ancestral background and specifically, flat out ask me if I was part Asian as a child. My brother as well, we used to own a dry cleaning business, and on a number of occasions, people, when they would come into our dry cleaners and I'd say, oh, well, who helped you, to try to figure out like where their clothing was, whatever. This being New Jersey in the non-PC early 90s, when I asked, well, who helped you? They'd be like, that Chinese guy, referring to my brother. So there was always this sort of, joke in my family that my mother's father was really the Asian mailman, and my dad would say this to my mother in front of my grandmother, so my biological grandmother. As I mentioned, even though my mother didn't grow up with her, she was a presence in our lives and she would occasionally come and stay with us. But the reason my mother didn't grow up with her is because she had mental illness. I think it wasn't properly diagnosed by today's standards. I don't know, it may have also been a substance abuse problem. But back then, quite frankly, they just kind of called people crazy and institutionalized them and put them in these horrible places that no longer exist. So she was an unfit mother. My mother didn't grow up with her, but we always knew her. And when she would come visit, my father was always the jokester, and he would occasionally say to my grandmother, who is an Irish woman, I don't know, Bridie, I think maybe the Chinese mailman might be Kathy's father, referring to my mom. And let's just say my grandmother did not appreciate that joke. She did not laugh, and she definitely got very tense around it. So where this story is leading is maybe it wasn't really that big of a surprise when I got my DNA test, my 23andMe results back, and I found out that I was a quarter Asian, which is essentially a full-grown grandparent. So my father's joking was almost right. He would joke Chinese. It was actually Japanese. So that was both shocking and not, because as I mentioned, my entire life there had been speculation, like I said, a lot from strangers asking about our ethnic background, and specifically whether or not we were part Asian. So I always kind of felt, I guess you could say, a kinship, because people thought that, a connection to Asian culture. I also always noticed that, and this is like pre-YouTube, I was always attracted to Asian makeup or Asian mascaras. And then even more so as the accessibility of that stuff came along, I would find myself watching Asian makeup tutorials because, things like my eyelashes, and maybe just my kind of paler skin. So it's this interesting thing where I did not have any actual cultural connection. I didn't have an Asian grandparent to talk to about that history. And now in my 40s, I'm 46 years old, we've still not managed to track down any relatives with that Asian ancestry. So that is a huge, huge desire of mine, is to hopefully one day find an Asian relative and be able to trace that person back and find out who the heck my grandfather was, because it's this huge question mark and huge mystery. And you've got to realize that for my mother, she was 80, I think, when she's 84 now, coming up on 84. So she was 80 years old when she found out that she was half Asian. Like, that's really weird. And, you know, just the idea that her dad was Japanese. The other strange thing is my mother was born in New York City and in 1936, which meant my grandmother would have conceived her in the fall of 1935. Now, the weird thing there is that historically, I've done a little bit of digging. There wasn't that huge of a Japanese population in New York City in 1935. There was a law that was passed in 1924, which prevented, I think specifically Japanese, from immigrating into the country. And so the only people who could come in at that time were, I think, like students and, you know, maybe doctors. So it's just really interesting to try to speculate where and how my Irish grandmother would have met a Japanese man in 1935 New York City. The other thing that I speculate about, not knowing anything really about that history, is my mother was taken out of my grandmother's custody when my mom was, I believe it was 7 or 8 years old, going on 9. And so if you do the math, that was like right smack in the middle of World War II, where there was all of this tension with the Japanese and where Japanese people were being put into internment camps. I find that kind of interesting, we'll say. The reason why she was taken out of my grandmother's custody is because my grandmother was institutionalized. Now, my mother has the memory of going with my grandmother to the hospital, and my mother sitting there in the waiting room all day long. So they took my grandmother in. Whatever was going on with her, they admitted her and I believe transferred her to the psychiatric ward. And my mother at this very young age was sitting in the waiting room, not having any idea what was going on. And I think she said she even fell asleep until she started hearing people closing up, and she kind of popped up and they were like, "Oh my God, who are you? Where are you from?" And she mentioned that her mother had come in earlier, and they were like, "Oh, we took Bridie away, or, Bridget, Blackburn away." And so they called up the police, and my mother, was picked up by the police. I think they went and found her older brother, who was maybe 12 at the time. And then they were transferred to a children's shelter. Again, this was, in the early 1940s. It was not a nice place. And then shortly thereafter, they were placed with a not very nice foster family or foster mother in upstate New York. And my mother lived with her till she was 14, then was placed at another foster mother's home when she was, I think it was 14 or 13, and she was placed with another foster mother in the Bronx. And fortunately, that foster mother was much kinder to her, and it was a much better place for her. So there's this, this amazing and crazy story. And, and now there's this other mysterious piece of it, with this question of like, oh, people always thinking we're Asian. As a matter of fact, we are Asian. We are part Japanese. And I would really, really, really love to find out how that happened and who my grandfather was. And I'm just so incredibly curious about that. So I don't know. I don't know if I will ever be able to solve this mystery, but I really hope that in my lifetime I can find out who my grandfather was and just answer that question, about my ancestry and my mother's ancestry. So that's my story about my DNA results. If anybody has any advice for a different company I might maybe do testing with that might have more of a Japanese population, because, you know, I think some of the criticism with 23andMe is that it doesn't have much of a Japanese or Asian population to draw from and to compare my genes to. Now, in terms of these things not being accurate, I did have my mother do separate testing with Ancestry, and her results completely lined up mathematically with mine. So, you know, that may not be perfect, but I would say that's a pretty good measure that, you know, it's not so wrong and that it's completely telling us we're part Japanese and we're not at all. I think that would be highly unlikely. But I have some other companies I'm going to send my DNA into. I believe it's Family Tree that perhaps has a slightly bigger Japanese population. But if anybody has any advice for me about other companies I should look into, I would love to hear about it. So comment below if you had a big surprise when you got your DNA results done. If you have any, you know, ideas or advice for me about how to dig into my past and, you know, potentially find this person where I don't have any kind of a name. You know, I don't have anything. You know, my grandmother, my Irish grandmother, died in 1988. So years before any of this information was unearthed or we had the technology to find this out. So if I do wind up getting any clues that lead me to this person, any relatives, I will make a video about that and keep you posted. But thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit that like button. And thanks so much. Bye.